it's not like the rug was pulled from under the feet of everybody in the industry. They changed the whole design of the house, right? It's like you've lost your currency on which you've lived your entire life.
In some sense, you could say ad tech has been in a bit of chaos for maybe 18 months or a little longer. We're going through a privacy revolution. Apple kicked the can first, perhaps with ad tracking transparency and the loss of the IDFA. Android is coming fairly soon. Google has already said it will sunset the GAID, the ad ID on Android. And of course, the third-party cookie is going away as well. That means trouble in some senses. If you're an ad network, you've got targeting challenges, you've got optimization challenges, you've got measurement challenges. In this series, Titans of Ad Tech, I'm going through and talking to some of the biggest ad networks on the planet and asking how they're managing it, what they're doing, what's working, what's not working, and how they envision the future. Today, we're chatting with InMobi. In fact, Kunal Nagpal, who's the Chief Business Officer of InMobi. Welcome, Kunal.
Hey, John, good to be here.
Hey, excellent to have you. Let's start super broad. How do ad networks have to change?
In a short answer, in every possible way. I think for a lot of people who are not from this industry, what they don't realize is that it's not like the rug was pulled from under the feet of everybody in this industry. They changed the whole design of the house, right? It's like you've lost your currency on which you've lived your entire life. The entire industry was built on cookies and device IDs, and that's how it was for 15 years, right? And now you suddenly take them away. It's not a shift. It's a radical adaptation that you'll have to do. Otherwise, obviously, nothing works in the status quo very, very soon. One thing that sort of surprises me, to be honest, is that how everybody thinks of cookies as the dominating problem, when I think the bigger problem actually is a device ID.
Mm-hmm.
Like the cookie world, let's go back in history. Like 3 years ago, the first indication happened. Apple again was the first one to say, this is not okay. So, Safari switched off cookies. Firefox followed right after. And then she was like, yeah, we still have, 70% of the world on Chrome. We'll be fine. And
Yes.
more often than not, every user generally uses more than one browser. It will be fine, right? And so they're all waiting with bated breath. When will Google say we'll switch off third-party cookies on Chrome? In anticipation, you had a whole new set of companies that came about, right? And companies that shifted their business model and said, we will bring an alternate identifier or universal ID, right? From ramp ID to, UID 1.0, then 2.0, then your ID5. You have all these companies, right, kicking in and saying, actually, we can do something about it. Fine. Cookies are not going to be deprecated until at least 24 at this point, right?
Yes.
Meanwhile, on the device side, the in-app world, 70% of the time share of anybody consuming media is on your phone. It's not on your laptop. So if the users are there, advertisers want to be there. Now add the real life difference in that while Safari was 25% of the browser market, iOS in revenue is more than 50% of this market.
Right.
With that being opt out, this is now existential in an urgent way, right? And then Google saying, we'll also switch off Google ID, by the way. And they're like, wait a minute. That timeline suddenly seems way more urgent, way more serious than the browser side and the third-party cookie conversation.
Yes.
What makes it worse, because the buy side, the agencies and the advertisers build their digital ad plan on desktop and web, they've not had a chance to get into this conversation yet. So the players who are trying to solve for an alternative ID are only now beginning to realize that actually, wait a minute, the in-app side is something that we've not even thought about. We've not solved for that architecturally. So now what am I solving for? Right? Like spends keep going down on web. They keep going on up on app. So am I building a solution that is for a, by definition, a business that is going to go away? What am I doing here? Right.
Yeah.
And I'm giving you all of this background and context, John, because your question was, how is the ad network changing? And my answer is in every possible way, because the world around it has changed. And if the buy side has not woken up to it, imagine how the ad networks are thinking about it. Right. We talked about, you sort of mentioned targeting and optimization and measurement. Everything was built on top of a device ID. Right. So what do you do for each of those aspects? Because all three of those aspects cumulatively make a campaign work. Otherwise, what are you, throwing money into a well?
Yeah.
And so they're all changing. Like targeting, does it have to be one-on-one? Yeah, that's the ideal state. We want to be there. That's what everybody was at. But if you take an identifier, can we find a viable alternative, which may not be a one-to-one replacement, but can it be like then 80% of the way, 90% of the way? Can we get to that world? Maybe a universal ID is the answer. Maybe cohort-based, targeting is the answer. And our stance is, it's not either or. You need to have, as a buyer, a portfolio of options of how you will get to a user in a way that it is still making sense on the ROAS of your campaign. And if you are an ad tech vendor, if you will, you should be able to support that entire portfolio of options. There is consented supply, right? Where you have an idea for your opt-in, even if it's 20%, it's still valuable, massively valuable. You can have consent agnostic, conversation, which would be cohort based. You could have contextual targeting. Go for it. The buy side talks about fingerprinting. None of them are zero-sum conversation. You need to have all of them to be able to do what you can do at any given point in time. And then that has, I think, increased the complexity to a whole new level.
I think you're 100% right there. And I have a good analogy. The whole house is torn down. It needs to be rebuilt. I want to talk about the model that works for the next decade, but I don't think there's one model, right? You mentioned, hey, everything was built on a device ID. Absolutely. If you look forward, you've got walled gardens, if you will, who know a lot about people on their walled garden, and they can assemble audiences around certain interests and other things like that, and then sell access to those audiences. You've got contextual, as you mentioned. You've got perhaps other options as Privacy Sandbox for Android comes out. You can use that for some degree of targeting.
Yeah.
On the iOS side, there's not a lot that really appears as a great targeting option, except opt-in, as you mentioned. What's the model that looks like it'll work to you for the coming decade?
I think there are potentially two different models that could work here. But I do think both of those models are going to come on top of what we at least believe in is a fundamental shift in how the economic power used to be with the buy side and how it is now moving to the sell side, right?
Interesting.
The buy side, for the longest time, was able to have a conversation with the advertisers. When I say buy side, I mean the agencies and the DSPs and all of those guys. For the longest time, they were able to say, hey, look, we understand users, we understand audiences, we have access to this data. 5 years ago, if you remember Blue Car, it was built on third-party audiences. That world went away. Now it's first-party audiences. But the one consistent was all the audiences were built on an identifier. So the buy side could profess to know and therefore add value in a campaign to improve targeting, to improve optimization, to, get the measurement done.
And potentially better than the sell side. Because they might know people on a publisher's app or on a website
100%.
Better than the publisher did.
100%. I mean, and it was an easy sell as a DSP, if I'm telling you, hey, look, I am seeing this user across these 4 exchanges and across these 5 environments, I know more. And here's the identifier that has helped me track them. So, trust me. I would trust them too, because they can see that. And this logical, it's intuitive. With the identifier gone, what do they rely on? And so now it is the opportunity of probably a lifetime for the sell side to say, fine, the identifier went away, but I still know my users. And how do I now leverage them and build a relationship with the advertiser directly in a way that is meaningful for them while I retain control that I lost over the last 15 years, right? Because I'm a publisher. Every publisher has this, by the way. Every publisher will have an internal ID to a user. It will not be the device ID, but it will be a publisher's ID. And the question now is, how do you monetize that? So to your original question of, what are the models that could come about? And I was saying there are 2 models. I think there is one model, which is, I am going to figure out a way, when I say I am to a generic way, I'm going to figure out a way to completely shift my business to the sell side relationships. And I'm going to power whatever solutions they are, whether it is seller-defined audiences, whether it is their need for a clean room, whether it is their need for, cohort-based targeting, whatever it may be. And I'm going to solve for that. And probably not a good time to be a DSP. So let me do that. Right. And there will be companies who will start specializing in providing that software as a service layer to help the publishers versus just being a pass-through, if you will. Right. I think that business model will evolve as companies go more and more into that. The second business model is the line between the DSP and the SSP will start blurring.
Interesting.
And I think some of that is happening. If you look at the last 2 years of how Trade Desk has evolved, we're like, well, we don't need anybody in the middle. I'm going to go connect directly to a CTV player, because they understand the CTV ecosystem does not have a unique identifier. So if I don't connect to them directly, I am going to create issues for myself. Right. So they went there. Then 3 months ago or 6 months ago, they're like, by the way, we don't like Google OB. Here's OpenPath. Nobody's altruistic. And I completely, give kudos to traders for doing that. But that is again, the DSP trying to be an SSP and connecting directly to the set of publishers that they like. Meanwhile, the SSPs are like, wait a minute, my only power can't be that I'm aggregating supply. Let me get closer to the buyers, to the advertisers and the agencies. So you have companies like Tremor saying, let me go buy InMobi because they have a DSP over there. Right. And you have companies like Verve buying DSPs out there. Like InMobi has always had a DSP and SSP. That world, I think, becomes closer and closer.
Interesting. Super interesting. If we look at the world of SSPs, supply side partners, platforms, and I think of Apple search ads, for instance. Apple search ads charges a significant premium in the mobile space for a couple different reasons. One, it's very intent driven. It's search driven. You see that. Two, they have better data about people than most other ad networks because they see people on the App Store. They see people in various Apple apps. They see a lot of stuff that happens in terms of in-app purchases. It's unclear what all of that they use, but they see a lot of data and they claim it all as first party, and therefore they can use it and it's privacy safe and other things that go on like that. Is there a world in which an SSP can, via perhaps more significant partnerships with the publisher side, start to aggregate insights across publishers and therefore drive higher values as well?
I think that would be the state of nirvana. Right?
Which means it'll never happen?
I think it's incredibly hard to replicate the proposition from an Apple store ad, for example.
Yep.
Right? It's now we're talking about like a Google level understanding of a user. For the independent ecosystem, that is nothing but like, a train that they cannot catch because it's running at 300 miles an hour. But the reality is, every step in that direction is going to be disproportionately powerful for the sell side platform, but also for the publishers.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, what happens, at least my sort of, projection of the future, if you will, is that what happens is you all get trapped as publishers under Google Topics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the Google Topics, the
It's not
proposition
that
that they have,
sophisticated.
well, what is worse is it completely advantages the bigger publishers.
Mm-hmm.
Because
You
if
see
you're
more
building,
activity.
who see more activity, who see more engagement, and therefore allow more opportunities for that user to be tagged in the three
Mm-hmm.
most important ways for it to be sold as a topic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now if I'm a small publisher and I had, let's say 50,000, but really dedicated user base, the monetization has just shifted to New York Times probably because they have 10 million. And now
Yes.
I have lost my value. Unless the publishers do something about this, they're going to get, in the reverse way, disproportionately impacted.
Super interesting. There's a lot to be seen with Privacy Sandbox as it starts to become implemented, and hopefully Topics API will be one of the areas that Google innovates significantly on. They are listening to the community and the ecosystem, and that is a good thing. And hopefully things will come to pass there that'll be better. But as you mentioned, nobody is altruistic in most cases, and people typically do things that make themselves work better. We've talked about targeting. We talked a little bit about audiences, including publisher-defined audiences and stuff like that. Optimization is another issue that is really, really challenging, right? I mean, with IDFA and GID, it's pretty easy. You see, you can instrument that. You can see, okay, this person, this customer, this user did X, did Y, was valuable, engaged, bought, whatever the case is. Now we've got significant other challenges. The Scan 4 is coming to replace Scan 3. It's going to take some time, maybe 3 to 6 months, maybe longer for the ecosystem to adopt. That has more postbacks, more information, but still very small. And Privacy Sandbox doesn't have really the same amount of information either. How do you see optimization shifting?
I'll tell you how I'm hoping it shifts. Because it is right now an incredibly challenging time. And I think I read this somewhere. Since the day Apple made IDFA, opt in on 14.5, something like 170 odd companies were funded in the adtech ecosystem who are all focused on the next gen solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're all going to approach the problem from multiple angles. Some of them will succeed, doesn't matter. It's all in the right direction. But I'm hoping how it gets solved in one direction at least is we move the conversation into neutral environments.
Mm-hmm.
When I say a neutral environment, I'm talking about either a clean room where there's a first party exchange, or better yet, move it to the client side and into the publisher environment.
Interesting.
Because then if you're able to do that, then the conversation of optimization is not linked to an identifier or to consent. It is linked to, quite simply, the match rate between an advertiser's first party data, or let's say even a middle person ad tech vendor's first party data and a publisher's first party data. And as long as you have that, you now know that this is the right kind of person I want to work with. And so then optimization kicks in right after that, right? Incredibly challenging. I'm not going to lie that this is, probably one of the hardest problems that the industry is going to solve over the next few years. But to the conversation that we had 5 minutes ago, if you can't optimize, what's the point of targeting?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
That is interesting about Privacy Sandbox because there is maybe not sophisticated, not totally sure yet, but there are two of those elements that you just mentioned in there. There is some on-device matching. There's some preloading of ads and other stuff like that. But there's also, I won't say clean room, but some kind of is it a trusted aggregation server, whatever Google's terminology is there, where some things can happen as well. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out and how that works. I do want to hit owned audiences because InMobi is not one thing. You've got a significant number of businesses that work together,
Right.
and you've got some owned audiences too. You've got some on-device stuff, right? First screen, lock screen, other things like that. How do you see owned audiences evolving? I mean, obviously, if you're Facebook or Google or Apple, you've got massive reach, right? Are you kind of dead in the water if you're an ad network that doesn't have something like that?
I wouldn't say you're dead in the water, but you are significantly kneecapped. If you don't have some sort of access, let's call it access, don't have to own it necessarily. Owning is obviously better, but if you have no access to first party audiences from a publisher lens, you are by definition limited in what you can do based on the premise that I had when I said 10 minutes ago, the economic power is shifting to the sell side, right?
Mm-hmm.
To give you an example, I hugely respect App11, hugely respect, right? I've followed Adam Pierogi for years, phenomenal execution, but all they have is gaming users. By definition, very limited data on those users. What do I do with that now? Like, have I just created a monster that is eating me now? Because I didn't need an email to, start a game. I didn't need to put any demographic information because it doesn't matter to play a game. During the game, there is no context for you to look at, and say, oh yeah, this person is running faster than slower. Who cares, right? It's a game. But you think of these things and you suddenly realize their lack of access to good, scaled, first-party data is a severe problem for them on their actual ad network business. And I have to believe that the smarter investors have seen that. And that's why they have been discounted so heavily, in the market over the last 10 to 11 months.
Super interesting topic, and we can't dive too deep into that, but it makes you think of Unity, of course, and IronSource. And Unity, knows a lot about players, knows a lot about people in games and experiences, because the technology that builds half of them is Unity's. Yep. And Unity can build some things to maybe instrument that, maybe do some things that we talked about from the sell side a little earlier. This has been a great conversation. You're clearly a deep thinker on the changes that are happening in the industry and what is going to happen in the future. Maybe let's end here. What changes do you expect in the near future, midterm future from InMobi?
I think you mentioned one thing earlier, that we have, our hands in a few areas. And one of them is our focus on the B2C side, right? Lock screen sort of discounts that point, but at least it, gets people to visualize that easily. But we also have independent properties that we're sort of, scaling up rapidly, and they're all non-gaming. We also have a play in gaming, but not from a content point of view. It is built around engagement of users in a gaming environment, right? Think a Twitch equivalent, think, like a skills equivalent, because it brings more context and user understanding, all of that. For us, it is a set path already that our B2B business, which is the ads business, and our B2C business, which is, this whole environment I was just talking about, they start coming together in the back end. The power of first-party data, the power of having publisher information is not lost on us. And that is where disproportionate effort and investments will go going forward.
Super interesting. I want to thank you for this time.
Thank you. It's great to have chatted with you.